A routine checkup led me to discover my wife's secret life, and it only got worse. Rick had always seen himself as a family man. He built his life around Megan, his wife of 18 years, and their two daughters, Lily, 16, and Ava, 13. Living in the historic Gold Coast neighborhood of Chicago, they had what most would call an ideal family life. Rick worked as an architect, designing projects across the city, while Megan, a community college professor, had recently taken on more evening commitments, as she called them. He'd admired her commitment to her students, but recently, Rick had sensed something different about her. She'd been distracted, and their interactions felt strained. He dismissed it, thinking it was just stress, until a fateful visit to the doctor turned his life inside out. There was a routine checkup at the West Side Health Clinic, and Rick had almost left without a second thought when the doctor came back with the results. "I'm afraid we found traces of chlamydia," the doctor said gently, assuming Rick would be aware of how he contracted it. But he wasn't. Stunned, he argued with the doctor, certain there had been a mistake, but the reality hit hard. Megan was the only possible source. The news gnawed at him all the way home, and by the time he arrived, every moment he'd ever spent trusting her replayed in his mind like a betrayal of its own. Unable to bear the weight of the secret, Rick drove to his parents' house in Evanston. His father, Henry, a retired Marine and the kind of man who met every hardship head-on, opened the door. His mother, Ellen, a compassionate woman with an iron will, immediately picked up on his distress. Over coffee at their modest kitchen table, Rick shared the painful truth. His parents listened, their support unwavering. His father's advice echoed in his mind as he drove home, a mixture of grief and anger pushing him forward. "Son, you're stronger than this. Protect your daughters, but don't lose yourself to her mistakes." That night, he confronted Megan. She came home with her usual excuse of a late meeting with students, but when Rick mentioned the diagnosis, her face turned pale. At first, she tried to deny it, saying there must have been a mistake, but her voice quivered, and she avoided his gaze. When Rick pressed her, demanding honesty, she finally broke down, revealing that she had been involved with someone else for over a year. Each word felt like a knife twisting deeper, and Rick struggled to contain his anger for the sake of his daughters sleeping down the hall. After that night, their home became a tense battleground. Megan had expected him to forgive her, but Rick refused, determined to protect Lily and Ava from the fallout. To ensure he was making the best choices, Rick sought legal advice. Lauren Bishop, his lawyer, was a sharp, compassionate attorney who listened carefully to his story and recommended a DNA test. As heart-wrenching as the idea was, Rick knew it was a necessary step to confirm his daughters were indeed his. The test results arrived a week later, confirming what Rick had known in his heart all along: Lily and Ava were his. The relief was overwhelming, but only deepened his resolve to shield them from Megan's deceit. As he processed the betrayal, Rick began to notice patterns he previously overlooked: times when Megan had been unusually distant, unexplained absences, and a growing disinterest in family life. He contacted Lauren again, and together, they began digging into Megan's double life. Lauren hired a private investigator, and within days, Rick received a folder full of evidence: photographs, text exchanges, and even witness accounts. Megan's affair wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment, it was an ongoing secret life. One evening, as he sat in his study, Rick listened to a recorded conversation where Megan mocked his loyalty, laughing with her lover about how easy it was to keep him in the dark. The betrayal hit harder than he'd expected, each word tearing apart the years they spent together. In a cruel twist of fate, the very next day he received a call from Mount Sinai Hospital. Megan had been in a car accident. The nurse on the phone informed him that she was in a coma, her injuries severe. Part of him felt numb, but another part of him felt relieved. He was shocked by his own reaction. When he arrived at the hospital, he barely recognized the woman lying in the bed surrounded by machines. She looked fragile, defenseless, a stark contrast to the woman who had hidden so much from him. The irony stung, and as he looked at her, he felt the remnants of his love fade away. Rick placed an envelope filled with all the evidence of her affair on the small table by her bed, along with his wedding ring. "This is goodbye, Megan," he whispered before leaving the room. 3 weeks passed before Megan woke up. By then, Rick had already started to plan his life without her. He moved his daughters to his parents' house for a temporary stay, where they were surrounded by family and love. One night, as they were watching a movie in the living room, Lily finally asked the question he'd been dreading. "Dad, are you and Mom going to get a divorce?" Rick looked into her anxious eyes and answered honestly, "Yes, sweetheart. But I want you to know that none of this is your fault. I love you both more than anything." The legal process began, and Rick prepared himself for the inevitable confrontation with Megan. When she was finally well enough to meet, he visited her in her new apartment in Logan Square, the place she'd chosen to start over. Her expression was one of remorse, and she tried to plead for another chance. But Rick's heart had hardened. He explained that he'd secured full custody of the girls and handed her the divorce papers without any intention of going back. Their assets were split, and Megan was left to face the consequences of her choices. In the months that followed, Rick focused entirely on rebuilding his family's stability. Life as a single father was challenging but rewarding. He threw himself into work and parenting, making sure every moment with his daughters counted. They had weekly family dinners with his parents, who provided a constant source of strength. The girls gradually opened up about their feelings, expressing hurt but also hope, and together, they created a new normal. One evening, Rick received confirmation that he was finally free of any lingering health concerns. His recent tests were negative, allowing him to fully close the chapter on Megan's betrayal. Standing on his balcony overlooking the Chicago skyline, he felt an unfamiliar sense of peace. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face it. He learned that he was stronger than he ever thought possible, and with his daughters by his side, he knew they could overcome anything.